We start with Iran, where the newly elected president, Ebrahim Raisi, said he would welcome Washington's return to the 2015 nuclear deal that Donald Trump abandoned, with some conditions, of course. Raisi's election prompted Israel's new prime minister to warn against making any kind of compromise with Iran.
This weekend, Iran chose a new president, Ebrahim Raisi. Of all the people that Khamenei could have chosen, he chose the hangman of Tehran, the man infamous among Iranians and across the world for leading the death committees, which executed thousands of innocent Iranian citizens throughout the years. Raisi's selection is, I would say, the last chance for the world powers to wake up before returning to the nuclear agreement and to understand who they're doing business with. These guys are murderers, mass murderers.
Not that global leaders are making much progress on their own. They met in Vienna over the weekend to revive their nuclear deal with Iran, marking the sixth round of talks since negotiations began 2 months ago. So let's just remind you of what's at stake here with this nuclear agreement. Concern that Iran was using its nuclear capabilities to build a nuclear bomb initially led to United Nations sanctions. World powers then offered relief from sanctions in exchange for Iran's curbing its nuclear program. Those incentives included lifting specific U.S. sanctions that trace back to 1979, when Iranian students took Americans hostage. President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the deal, leading Iran to restart its banned nuclear work. His successor, Joe Biden, wants to return to the accord, but both Tehran and Washington appear to be hedging their bets, saying the other must make the first move. Soraya Lenny is an Iranian-Australian analyst and author of a new book, Crooked Alleys, Deliverance and Despair in Iran. Soraya joins us now from Melbourne. Soraya, good to speak with you again. Joe Biden made a campaign promise to restore the Iran nuclear deal, so we know that he's invested. Is the newly elected Raisi just as invested in restoring the nuclear deal as Biden?
I don't know if Raisi personally is that invested, but I think the Iranian state is that invested. I think, a decade ago when these talks began, and some of them, began in secret with the Obama administration, there was quite a lot of opposition within state apparatus and within the hardliners in Tehran. But what we've seen in recent years is that the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, has become state policy. So I think regardless of what somebody may think individually, this is a state policy, and I think these talks are going to continue as they have been.
Raisi is a hardliner. He's also a protege of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. There's this view that while he may be the public face of the country, he will end up doing whatever Khamenei wants him to do in the end. Do you agree with that, or is there a possibility that Raisi could go rogue here?
Raisi is somebody who has had a pretty easy path to the presidency. And I say that in terms of, the fact that he was appointed judiciary chief just a couple of years ago. And you don't get appointed judiciary chief if you're not trusted by the state. So he has the trust of the main institutions, including unelected institutions in Iran, which is incredibly important. And that speaks to, I guess, the faith they have in him of, towing the line. However, having said that, Ahmadinejad was also somebody who had implicit trust from the state, including we saw in that disputed 2009 election. But he ended up, quote, going rogue in 2011 and eventually really fell out of favor with the state to the point where he tried to run for president, of course, this year and was banned again.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I want to play some comments for you from what U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said this weekend. Let's take a listen.
Well, I think what we need to do in the United States is keep our eye on the ball. And that is our paramount priority right now is to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. We believe that diplomacy is the best way to achieve that rather than military conflict. And so we're going to negotiate in a clear-eyed, firm way with the Iranians to see if we can arrive at an outcome that puts their nuclear program in a box.
So the New York Times reports that because Raisi won't be inaugurated for another 6 weeks, the Biden administration believes it actually has a fairly limited window here to strike a final deal with the outgoing administration, which is more moderate on this nuclear deal. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Absolutely. I think that's a very pragmatic and a very realistic stance that the Biden administration is taking. I think that's also the position in Tehran, though, by the way, and amongst the other negotiators. So there's only, around 40 days, I suppose you could say, until the Raisi administration is inaugurated. And that would mean ostensibly a change of negotiating teams. So that's also incredibly important. I think it's in also Raisi's interest to get this deal done before he comes into office, because, if things go awry with the nuclear deal, as they did with the Trump administration, Raisi can then always blame the Rouhani administration because technically they would have signed it.
Right. It gives him an out on both ends there. How much runway do any of the Iranian presidents have when it comes down to anything? Rouhani, as we said, considered moderate, didn't really have much agency. Raisi, of course, is a protege of Khamenei, but he may be just as limited, even though he's a hardliner. Ultimately, feels like any of these elected Iranian presidents don't really have much wiggle room. So it all comes down to what Khamenei wants. And I guess my question to you is, how has what he wants changed or evolved as the sanctions have become more painful?
That's interesting, because I think Khamenei has shown a lot of flexibility when it comes to certain issues, depending on, I suppose, what they classify to be a priority. So, where the nuclear deal was a red line at one point, we saw that actually, no, he was very open to those talks. As I said, a decade ago, Khamenei is the one who, signaled the green light to enter those talks, including direct talks with the United States. I think this is an important issue, but I also think, yes, the economy has become such a problem in terms of high inflation and unemployment specifically, that these are really priority issues amongst the people. I think that sort of translates, though, to priority amongst the state, because economic stability and economic growth I think really does placate the population in a very important way. However, I think the priority of the state, as we've seen in this election and the veto process, is more uniformity and stability amongst the ranks of the institutions and the state, rather than, I suppose, what the people probably prioritize.
Gotcha. Well, the wrinkle, of course, is that the newly elected Raisi is also personally subject to these U.S. sanctions that were imposed under Donald Trump, and the White House has not given any indication that it would lift these. I mentioned earlier how some of these sanctions date back to 1979, the Iran hostage crisis. How does the enduring American perception on Iran and everything that goes on there, how it's always seen through the prism of what happened in 1979, limit our ability to fully understand the motivations and the complexities of Iran's leadership and what they want?
Completely correct. I think since 1979, the U.S. perception of Iran has basically been molded through that lens of the hostage crisis and watching those U.S. hostages be taken by the students at the embassy in Tehran. I think a lot has changed. It's 40 years ago. Iranians have moved on. This is a different population. That was a very different time. And a lot of those hostage takers now are reformists who themselves have been jailed by the Islamic Republic, which they helped create. So I think, there needs to be a complete shift in Washington vis-a-vis perceptions of Iran and amongst the American public as well. I don't think, Iranians are not the enemy. Iranians are traditionally quite pro-West, pro-US, particularly compared to other countries in the Middle East as well. And I don't think it's in anyone's interest, least of all the people of Iran, to continue with these perceptions.
Got it. Well, perhaps something will happen in the next 6 weeks then. There's an actual deadline there to work with. Surya Lenny, thank you so much for joining us. She's an analyst on Iran and author of Crooked Alleys, joining us from Australia. Thanks for watching Bloomberg Quick Take Now. Subscribe to our channel to see the biggest stories the moment they happen from around the world, and tune in to our 24/7 live stream for global news coverage, interviews, deep dives, shows, and documentaries on the stories you care about.